Hello, how are you doing? So I have a continuous issue where I will optimistically buy a really long, acclaimed novel, being genuinely really excited to read it, but I'll put it on my bookshelf and it'll sit there for years and years and years. And so I've found something to help combat this is to make a TBR pile, a to be read pile at the beginning of each year as a resolution of a group of really big books that I want to read over the course of the year. And I find that setting this list for myself really helps me to, actually get to some of these books that have just been sitting on my bookshelves. And so I've picked 6 books that I want to read this year, and I'll be really interested to know if you've read any of them, if you'll give me some encouragement to actually read them, or if you're interested in reading them as well. It'll be really interesting to, you can join along in my challenge if you want to, or if you have other big books that you've been wanting to get to, I'd like to know about those in the comments below as well. But yeah, I'm gonna need some real encouragement for this list because I have some whoppers here, including, I think, the longest novel that I'll have ever read, if I actually get around to reading it. So here is the pile of books in total. And yeah, you can see for 6 books, I mean, I know it looks like 7 books, but one of the books is split into 2 separate copies, and because it is that long. And yeah, so a combined total page length of 5,064 pages between all these 6 books. And it's a good thing that I also rejoined the gym at the beginning of this year, because I'm going to need some real muscle to be able to hold up these books for the amount of time it's going to take to read them. So I'm going to go through all these books and talk about why I'm interested in reading them, and yeah, and a little bit about them. So first off, there's A Suitable Boy by Vikram Seth, which is an enormous novel. It's 1,349 pages long. And but everyone I've talked to about this book and who's read it said it is an absolutely magnificent experience, and I think it's a novel that I'm really gonna love as well. And if you saw my video when I went to my parents' house in Maine in America for Thanksgiving, I retrieved this book from a box of books that I had stored in there, and so I said at the time that I wanted to bring it back with me and resolve to read it, and now I'm making that resolution that I will read this year. It's such a huge length, and so on the surface this story is quite simple because it's about a mother and daughter in early 1950s in India, shortly after the country's independence, and it's about them both trying to find a suitable partner for the daughter, and that quest, but meeting a number of different families along the way, and looking at the various social and political turmoil in India at that time, as the country was going through a lot of rapid changes, and looking at the multi-ethnic groups in the country. And yeah, it's just sounds like such an epic, monumental work. And I love at the very beginning of it there are family trees, and I love a big family saga, and so I get so excited when I see family trees at the very beginning of a book. So yeah, I'm hoping to read this. I think even if I listen to it on audiobook form, the audiobook length is around 64 hours long or something like that. So I'll probably do that method I do when, especially reading really long books, of when I'm at home, I'll read this beautiful physical copy I have, and then when I'm out about, like going for a long walk or something, I'll listen to the audiobook version, and so have that kind of combined experience. And yeah, and this is a signed edition of the novel, which I brought back with me, so yeah, I did want to have this here on my bookshelves. And interestingly, with this book, I think it was first published in the 90s, I mean, maybe even the early 1990s. But in 2009, Vikram Seth announced that he was writing a sequel to this novel, and a lot of people were very excited. A lot of his fans of this book were really excited. But year after year, the novel still hasn't come out, and I think it was going to be called A Suitable Girl. And but yeah, well, it sounds like it's equally going to be a monumental work because yeah, it's still not been published, and like year after year he keeps missing publication deadlines, and so but apparently he is still at work on it. I think I saw a news article from a year or two ago saying that he was still working on it. So so yeah, hopefully I'll read this, and then by the time I finish reading it, maybe the sequel will have come out. The Books of Jacob by Olga Tokarczuk. This is the Nobel Prize winner's big new epic novel, 928 pages long. I mean, it's not actually a new novel. It's newly translated into English by Jennifer Croft and was just published recently in the US and the UK. And it's about the life of Jacob Frank, who was an 18th century Polish Jewish religious leader that had a very varied and crazy life, and so Tokarczuk tries to approach his life from a number of different angles in this this story, and it's really interesting. Fitzcarraldo edition that published it here in the UK brought up this translated interview with Tokarczuk about writing this book and the task of writing this book, and how she became so interested in his life and his writings, and just out of pure curiosity at first, and didn't plan on writing anything about his life. But then as the more she got into it, the more fascinated she became by his life and wanted to write something about it, but how his life was so varied that it presented a lot of challenges, and how she was going to approach it and how she was going to write about it, and is one of these individuals that has a lot of contradictions to him, and how do you encapsulate that in a novel. And so I'm so curious to read this book, and though there's been some mixed reactions to it, and I myself have had mixed reactions to Tokarczuk's writing that I've read in the past. I loved her novel Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead. I thought that was such a fascinating and entertaining book. But her novel Flights, which won the International Booker Prize, I just didn't really get on with, and I DNF'd it. Actually, I put it aside after I think 70 or 80 pages, because I just really wasn't enjoying it. But yeah, I do want to read this new book as well, because yeah, a lot of people have been talking about it. It might be up for this year's International Booker Prize, and so yeah, I do want to get to it, but I'll need to steel myself for it. A Fraction of the Whole by Steve Toltz. This is only 711 pages long, and this is one of those books that's just been sitting on my shelves for ages, because it was first published in 2008, and so I bought this copy then, and yeah, it's just been sitting up there on my bookshelves, and I keep wanting to get around to it. And he's published some subsequent books, including a novel called Quicksand, which I did read and really enjoyed, and though I think this novel was like much more acclaimed. And he does have a new novel that is coming out in a few months' time, which I talked about in an earlier video, and that I am excited about. So yeah, I do want to get to this novel, which has an amazing cover. It's kind of like perforated, you can see, and with this, like, it's the cover is actually pink, but yeah, see, but then it has these perforated things so that you can see through. And I love that the description of this book is: sane families are all alike, but every crazy family is crazy in its own way, which is a great description. I think it's the story of a father and son, and the father had a very difficult life, and his son, now that his father has died, is trying to reconcile and come to an understanding of who his father was, and what his father gave to him over the course of this long story. And so yeah, I'm really excited to read this, because his novel, his writing, at least from what I've read, is quite funny and entertaining, as well as really insightful and interesting. So yeah, I'm looking forward to this. Another new novel is Moon Witch Spider King by Marlon James. This is the second novel in his Dark Star trilogy, which he's been writing over the past few years. And I loved the first book, Black Leopard, Red Wolf, and this is the second volume at 626 pages long, and it's following some of the same events that were covered in the first book from a different perspective, from a moon witch who's 177 years old, called Sogalon, and following the story of her life and seeing those events through her perspective of a quest of a group of people that in medieval Africa, amidst warring kingdoms, that go on this quest to find this mysterious boy that's gone missing, and yeah, and following from her perspective as and also how she's been stalked by a demonic spirit called the Spider King, and which I'm sure it's going to be filled again with a lot of sex and violence, but is the kind of story that just makes me fall in love with fantasy again, and the imaginative areas that like fiction can go to, and how I first fell in love with reading when I was younger, like reading fantasy novels. And this is a very adult, fantasy novel, and this series that he's writing, but it has that same kind of imagination and vigor that just makes me love fiction. Then I have an older novel which was newly translated and published in English for the first time in the past year or two, which is Stalingrad by Vasily Grossman. It's 892 pages long, and this author in this book have a really fascinating history, because this was first written in the early 1950s under the Soviet regime, and I think it was sort of written in a way that was in compliance with the Soviet regime, but then he wrote a novel called Life and Fate after this, following the same family which was introduced in this novel in the lead up to the Battle of Stalingrad, and that novel was seized by the KGB. That novel is called Life and Fate, and it was seized by the KGB and not published in Russia, but then was smuggled out and published in the West. And yeah, and that novel is considered a great classic. But this novel was actually written before that, and so it was kind of like a prequel to that, but it was published here in the West after that, and so the translators and the editors, so the translators for this were Robert and Elizabeth Chandler, and they tried to translate this book in a way which was more compliant with some early drafts of it before he made some changes in order to be sort of more compliant with the Soviet regime. I think that's the history of it, but yeah, it sounds like such a fascinating story, and is meant to be like a Life and Fate and this book are meant to be like great epics on sort of the same level as like War and Peace, and I think he consciously wrote them with the intention of trying to capture his current times in such an epic way. And so yeah, I'm really fascinated by this story, and I do want to read. I've not read Life and Fate, but I do want to read it. But I thought it would be interesting to approach it from the beginning of the story, looking at this family's origins and then seeing the situations they get into in the next novel, Life and Fate. And finally, the sixth big book that I want to read this year is, well, actually not a read, but a reread, is Belle Fleur by Joyce Carol Oates, which is such an epic family saga, and it's 528 pages long, so it's the shortest book on my list. But when I read this in sometime, I think my early to mid-20s, I loved this story so much. And again, it's a family saga with a big family tree at the very beginning of it, following this wealthy family, the fates and fortunes of this wealthy family in upstate New York, and following them over many years and through the different generations, and but having a sort of wealthy central patriarch, but then following his progeny and his children in their varied lives. I remember there's a very sensitive poet, and there's a like headstrong businessman that gets into a lot of trouble, and a social reformer, and so yeah, all sorts of different experiences. And this was written in the 1980s when Joyce Carol Oates was trying to use a form of like magical realism, and also a form of like genre storytelling, where she was writing about the Gothic but in this like using distinctly like American subjects, and looking at American history and American society through the lens of this family. And it's the first in a series of Gothic novels that she wrote. There were 5 in the series, which were published over many, many years. And yeah, it's just an incredible story, and it has at the center of it a kind of magical cat called Mahalil, who you can see here on the cover in this beautiful illustration. And this was reprinted several years ago along with some of Joyce Carol Oates' other books, and I tried rereading it at the time. Well, I was rereading it at the time and really enjoying it, but I made that tragic mistake of reading a big book where there were other books I wanted to read, and I just got distracted, and so I was like, oh, I'll just put this down for the moment and then I'll go back to it, and I just never went back to it and finished reading it. So you can see I got quite a good way through it, but I would like to start it again from the very beginning, just to enjoy this epic family story, which is filled with so much wonder and magic, as well as psychological intrigue. And honestly, I just can't praise this book enough. So those are some of the big books that I want to get to this year. I mean, I already started the year reading a really big book, Hanya Yanagihara's new novel, which was a like big achievement in itself, I think. But yeah, I do really want to get to these other books. So like I said, if you've read them and would recommend them, let me know about that in the comments below, or if you're interested in reading them as well, or if you have your own TBR list of really big, long books that you want to tackle over 2022. I'd love to hear about them in the comments. But I hope you're reading good things and having a wonderful day, and I'll speak to you again soon. Bye-bye.